This is an interview with Michael Lesy. He's a professor of literary journalism at Hampshire College in Amherst, Massachusetts. And he's also the author of a forthcoming book to be published by Norton Press called Murder City, which is based upon a series of murders in the 1920s in Chicago. And that book will be out in 2007. And one of the cases that he talks about in that book, and one of the chapters of that book, is about the Orthwein case. And that chapter is going to be published in Tri-Quarterly in 2006. So Michael, why don't we start with you reading a little bit from your chapter on the Orthwein case.
Thank you. I'd be pleased to. I'm thrilled to be here.
Thank you.
So this is how the chapter begins. And some of these are direct quotes, some of the more purple prose. It's direct quotes from the article, and this is all from the Tribune. Police found, quote, Mrs. Cora Isabella Orthwein, former St. Louis society woman, sobbing over the body of Herbert P. Ziegler, the married man for whom she had sacrificed husbands, family, and friends. A revolver with 2 empty chambers lay nearby. Close at hand was a bottle of creme de menthe. A few feet away was an open bottle of gin. And this, by the way, is all in quotes. And now, a copy of Robert W. Service's The Spell of the Yukon lay on a table by her bed. Service's poem, The Harpy, stared up at the police who, quote, burst into the disordered apartment. Quote, I paint my cheeks, for they are white, and cheeks of chalk men hate. Mine eyes with wine I make them shine, that men may seek and sate. Midway through the poem was a stanza that, quote, she had regarded as wise enough to underscore heavily, quote, from love's close kiss to hell's abyss is one sheer flight, I trow, and wedding ring and bridal bell are will-o'-wisps of woe, and 'tis not wise to love too well, and this all women know. Mrs. Orthwein sat, quote, on a bench before a baby grand piano. Her eyes were closed, and she was swaying from side to side. Quote, I shot him, she cried. I loved him, and I killed him. It was all I could do. Close quote. And this is newspaper prose.
Exactly. And not only that, but the story, that's everything, right? It's the woman who runs away with somebody else's husband. It's the guns. It's the alcohol. It's the police bursting in.
It's the poem.
It's the poem.
I mean, can you imagine a newspaper piece beginning with Robert Service today?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But, you know, talk a little bit about how you came across this case, how you found these cases that make up the stories in your book, and a little bit about those archives.
All right. I came on this case because I was looking at photographs. And I was looking at photographs, specifically a collection that's online, through the Library of Congress, through the Library of Congress's American Memory website. Inside that are a series of collections, photographic collections that they've digitized. And one of them is linked to a collection at the Chicago Historical Society. It's the collection of the Chicago Daily News. And
let me just note here that that collection is linked to this website because, of course, our collection of 11,000 homicides, many of them have pictures that were in the Daily News and have a specific reference there.
Many, but certainly not all. I mean,
not all.
The Daily News, in the 1920s, the decision to make photographs is not a huge revolutionary decision, but it's a commitment of resources and so on. So the cases they decide to photograph are sort of archetypal, epic,
right,
almost fairy tale in quality, except they're sort of dark fairy tales.
They're cases they think the readers will be interested enough in that they want a picture.
Well, let's put it this way. Chicago was a very bloody-minded place in the 1920s for a lot of reasons. The murder rate was 20% higher than the national urban average. Right. New York City was 30% below the national urban average. People in Chicago, it wasn't just gangsters shooting each other. It's people in Chicago not only shooting and killing each other, but reading about it. And they liked this stuff. Yeah. So the newspapers deploy the photographers eventually get digitized. The stuff gets put up on the web through the Library of Congress. Yes. And I end up trying to teach a course in the use of photographs as historical documents to a bunch of very bright first-year students at Hampshire College.
Yeah.
And I look at this stuff because I don't want to lead them into an abyss. I look at the stuff to say, all right, what is this stuff? What's it like? If I give them assignments, will they go crazy?
Yeah.
So I looked at this site because I wanted to assign it. And because I'm a bloody-minded person myself, I used a key search word, murder. And so I typed in murder, and out comes hundreds and hundreds of hits in the Chicago Daily News.
Right.
And what do I know?
So as a researcher, your question is, what's going on here?
Yes. And I didn't really know. So I looked at all the hits, and I thought, well, now, what do I know about that I could look at? And I knew about Leopold and Loeb. I mean, who doesn't know? It's like St. Valentine's Day. It's these little gifts the city of Chicago gives to our national nightmare. So I looked at Leopold and Loeb, and I see photographs of Clarence Darrow like I've never seen him before. And I see photographs of those two boys I've never seen before. I'm astonished. There may be 200 of them. Courtroom photographs, crime scene photographs, pictures of Darrow, pictures of the mental health experts who I'd never heard of, pictures of the judge. So I'm thinking to myself, this is amazing stuff. Not only am I going to assign it, but I'm going to look more. Now the point of looking more is I'm trying to unpack the pictures. The pictures are enigmas. They're not bloody crime scene photographs. Of the hundreds of hits under the search word murder, there may be one or two that are bloody. Some guy got beaten to death because he was a gangster with baseball bats. He's laid out. Cora Isabella Orthwine, she has a couple of bedroom photographs. It's a pretty messed up bedroom. She shot the guy as he was coming at her with a stool in his hand. Other than these two, it's mostly pictures of people's faces. And you look at the faces, you realize they've done something really stupid, really horrendous. They're really faces of people engaged in some acts of folly. And you ask yourself, as a human being, so who were these people?
I think that becomes the great question when you look at these photographs, both the photographs on our website, the ones on the Daily News website, and also as you read the narratives of the homicide cases in the data set, you say, who are these people?
Yeah. I think it's archaeology. I mean, essentially, you dig up a fragment of, let's say, a stone fragment of a lion's paw, and you're looking for the rest of the lion. And that's what every historian and every person with a literary imagination is inclined to do. One thing led to another, and I started reading the newspapers. Now, when I started reading the newspapers, which were in, the month of July 2005, I was here a year ago, and the only way I could read the newspapers was by reading microfilm. So I'd go down to the public library downtown, the Herald Washington branch. I'd stand outside with all the guys who didn't have places to sleep, and we'd all walk into the library early in the morning. They'd go upstairs, I'd go upstairs, they'd sit in front of the microfilm readers just to pass the time, and I'd start reading microfilm. And it was horrendous. Microfilm, bad shape, brittle, scratched, illegible. Now, ladies and gentlemen, you can search it using something called ProQuest. Your library has to subscribe to it in the way that they use a ProQuest for the historical New York Times, but ProQuest now serves the historical Chicago Tribune. Now let's face it, there are a lot of newspapers in Chicago. The one that survived is the Tribune.
The Tribune, right.
But that doesn't mean that there are other ways of looking at this stuff, and microfilm still is the only way to get complex, different points of view other than the Tribune's. The fact is, by mid-decade, 1920s, 1925, the Tribune owns most of the major stories in terms of its resources, its talent, its photographic coverage, and so on. But there's the Daily News, for example, that I was using. There's the Herald Examiner. There are at least 5. What was it?
There's the Record. The Inter-Ocean is a very important paper, too. Right. And I have to have a small footnote here to the American Newspaper Repository, whose archives are now at Duke University, and you can see the actual paper copies
Right.
of the Chicago Tribune from 1880 forward.
Right.
But Chicago was amazing in having so many newspapers, and of course, newspapers came out several times a day. There was a morning edition, an evening edition.
And the stories changed from morning to evening to afternoon. Also, we should note, there's the Chicago Historical Society. So, I mean, they do have bound copies of whether it's the Daily News or whether it's the Tribune. They've got stuff too.
Yeah.
And it's through them, and they're digitizing the Daily News stuff, that complete fools and strangers like me get a chance to see things like those photographs.
Say a little bit about your prior work, because it's not as though you came to this as your first project.
So what I am, I guess, classically, is an American cultural historian. So I'm trained as an undergraduate in things like anthropology and sociology, but my graduate training is in American history. So I study American history, and I'm fascinated by photographs. I'm a photographer. I love to take pictures. I like to look. So what I end up doing is I study with a guy named Warren Sussman, who is a savant, a cultural historian, and he allows me to look and use photographs as primary data. So instead of just using them as illustrations, this is a picture of, I don't know, President Eisenhower, and we use it to illustrate a chapter in a history textbook about the 1950s. You look at collections of images. Not one, not two, not 20, not 30, thousands. Thousands. And you develop visual imagination, visual recall, and you begin to build the idea of sequences, how one picture can be put next to another to create a nonverbal narrative and forward what amounts to an argument. Also, the photographs are revelations. They're both forms of information and poems. They are both male and female, wet and dry, hot and cold. They are changeable entities. And I started with a book in 1973 about a small town in Wisconsin, Black River Falls, during the Great Depression. I juxtaposed images by the town photographer with excerpts from the local newspaper. Made a book, called a collage, call it a film made of paper. And I kept looking at photographic archives since the early 70s. Book after book, archive after archive, greater number of images after greater number of images. The Chicago Daily News, maybe 60,000 images.
Yeah, amazing. Talk a little bit about how the web has really revolutionized this.
Oh, it's astonishing.
You had to go to a library
Right.
and sit there and find the photographs and so on.
Oh, and you have to, but with the web, everything's now more and more is digitized. So you can sit wherever you want. That's obvious to everyone looking at this. They're sitting somewhere looking at us, chatting to each other in July in Chicago, and they're somewhere else, Nome, Alaska. Who knows? So the web's wonderful. That said, for example, during the Great Depression, the government sent 16 illustrious photographers out to make a photographic survey of the United States called the Farm Security Administration Office of War Information Survey. Now, there are 145,000 images now digitized, available to everyone who goes to the Library of Congress American Memory website. You can look until your lamps burn out. But the point is that the guy who ran the survey back in the 1930s thought some pictures by, let's say, great artists like Walker Evans were worthy of being titled and preserved, and some he didn't like. So he never had them titled, and they never got printed. But the Library of Congress made these images through reversing the negatives. So every image on the negative gets reversed into a positive. And they display these things as contact sheets. So you can see 2,000 heretofore unknown Walker Evanses. In other words, there is data now available to you, not only from a distance, but data that was never even visible, even if you sat for hours in Washington, D.C. at the Library of Congress. So it's revelatory stuff.
And of course, we're so fortunate to have institutions like the Library of Congress, which make these kinds of materials available. As you say, it's a new window into the 30s that the people in the 30s didn't have.
It's a new window into everything. So you can use these images to teach high school students, to open up their hearts and their minds and their imaginations. You can use it for college students, and you can use it for civilians so that people who have different points of view other than me or anyone else can tell their own stories. These are subversive, wonderful, unexplored data sources.
Let's go back to the Chicago Daily News archives. Did the Chicago Daily News have particularly talented photographers?
No, I wouldn't say so. I mean, these are, you know, given a distance of 60 or 70 years or more, they're pretty nice looking images. Mm-hmm. The Daily News was working with 8x10 view cameras. I mean, they're really antique things. Again, the Tribune essentially deploys more advanced technology and better photographers. But look, beggars can't be choosers. This is what we've got. It's public property. You have to pay the Chicago Historical Society a fee for a print, but you can sit in your own room with a laser printer, press, click, whatever, and get a facsimile to work with.
Exactly. So when you came across all these photographs and when you clicked on murder in Chicago,
yeah, right.
How'd you start selecting? What made you pick one case
the faces,
over another?
The faces. And also, I mean, look, again, the Daily News and the Tribune are not sending photographers for every murder. I mean, your database, which is 1870 through 1930, has how many?
11,000.
Okay, 11,000. They're not 11,000 cases or 5,000 or 3,000 that get turned into front page stories that go on day after day after day after day, like installments in a Dickens novel.
Exactly. And that is their appeal, I think. They have that dramatic quality which becomes a narrative over a course of days. People care about them. You know, why do you think people care more about one case than another? I mean, this becomes a very profound question, I think, for prosecutors and defense attorneys, because there will be a murder case which all of a sudden takes off. Everybody cares about it. And the prosecution of that case will then change dramatically.
Well, look, I think, you know, power, money, greed, sexual desire, fear, people saying one thing and then changing their story. I mean, one of the beauties of the newspaper stuff is how the stories get layered and how they change from day to day. Not only are these things fabrications, but they're fabrications of fabrications, or variations on truths that keep on getting spun out like filigrees. So that the pleasure of oral histories, of tales told around, you know, some campfire, you know, is one of the pleasures of they're stories.
Yeah, they're great stories too. And again, a number of the cases that you write about, the story changes. You know, somebody comes in with a story about what happened in a particular time and place. And of course, one of the reasons why we're also interested in murder is with a murder, as soon as you have a murder, you have the end of at least one story. You have the end of the story for the victim, but you have the picking up of the story of the defendant, and you have going backward to everything that precipitated the murder or the events leading up to it, and then you have the story going forward of the defendant, and that's going to be structured by the court system.
The murder is like a trench, like an archaeological trench, and it opens up layers of society. So you not only have the perpetrators, the victims, and so on, but then you have the cops and who they are and how they work or how they don't work. And then you have the prosecutors, how they work and how they don't work. And then you have the judges, how they work and they don't work, and the lawyers and how they work and they don't work. And then the stories keep changing. And finally it ends. Either someone gets hung or someone gets allowed to walk away. On to the next story, because it's like salted nuts at a bar for these people in Chicago in the 20s. Tell us another one.
Exactly, and the newspapers do, and you are going to tell us quite a few of them in your book. But let's go back to some of the complexities of the legal system and the people who are involved. You have State's Attorney Crow, who's prominent in a number of these cases. Tell us a little bit about him.
All right, Crow is, I think he was the youngest appointed or elected, God, I can't even remember, criminal court chief magistrate. He grows up, I think, in Peoria. He goes to Yale. I mean, he's a rising star. He has political ambitions. And he's a sour-looking man. He doesn't, you know, he's an avenger. He's a classic prosecutor. And he wants to make people believe that he's in control of a completely out of control set of circumstances. So Crow goes from the earliest case, which is, as far as I can tell, the case of a wonderful, perverted, cruel man named Carl Wanderer, Lieutenant Carl Wanderer, who kills his pregnant wife and a ragged stranger who he picks up on the street to make it appear as if this ragged man has killed the wife. Lieutenant Wanderer goes, Crow is the first, shows up there, and Crow goes through the Leopold and Loeb case. He goes through all of the gangster cases, 26, 27, 28. He finally gets thrown out of office in 28 because people are simply fed up.
They're tired of the fact that the murders keep coming, and maybe they're just a little tired of him. But he's certainly one of the crusading prosecutors who become kind of legendary figures in American history.
Is he?
And, well, if you look at his role in all those cases,
Yeah.
I mean, it's Leopold and Loeb, it's Wanderer, I mean, who's the prosecutor? And again, the fact he comes out of an elite Eastern institution,
Sure.
he comes back to Chicago, you know, he's going to have a career, and so on. And of course, that also raises the question of politics.
Or he makes
and the
deals.
law.
Makes deals with Bill Thompson. He makes deals with Dean O'Banion. He makes deals with McSwiggan, who is this young prosecuting attorney who Capone also has in his pocket. I mean, everyone has been making deals with everyone else, and then Crow gets to stand up in front of reporters and says, "This must end. I promise that this will end. I promise every citizen will be safe in his hearth, and this lawlessness will come to a stop immediately." And of course, it plays out over 3 years and 3 different trials, and the guys who have just shot and killed 2 detectives in cold blood walk away claiming self-defense.
I know, they walk away scot-free. Well, that raises a number of other issues which are both touched upon in your book, but also elsewhere and by many other commentators. You know, the whole role of organized crime. This is the height of of Prohibition and the organized crime domination of Chicago. And that, of course, captures the public imagination. I mean, if you go to the farthest corner of the earth today and you say Chicago and people say bang, bang, you know,
Sure.
it's still, that reputation is still there.
By 26, I would say 27, Chicago is becoming aware of the fact that it now has a reputation in all of the major capitals of the earth as a place where blood runs in the streets. And it feels terrible about this, absolutely terrible.
Chicago's horrified, and it wants to get rid of this image.
Let me tell you how it starts, because I mean, this is the pleasure of it all. Dean O'Banion, who is this gimp-legged guy, who is essentially a joker. I mean, he's grows up in an Irish ghetto. He does things like hijack whiskey all the time, makes $1 million a year, which is equivalent to $10 million a year in today's money. Dean O'Banion and a whole bunch of other people, like the Annenberg family, get their start as toughs working for either the Tribune, whether they're McCormick's or the Hearsts, in newspaper wars that go on for 20 years. People get shot, killed, trucks get driven into the river, newsboys get blown away, people reading the wrong newspaper on a trolley get shot. Dean O'Banion begins to hijack things, newspapers, and then he goes on to hijacking whiskey. A lot of this stuff starts around newspapers.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, there's 750 newspapers and journals published in Chicago in 1908. I mean, it's just astonishing, and in every language, to every group, and so on. And these newspaper wars are major, and newspapers buy each other out, and then they incorporate the titles, so it's no longer the Record and the Herald, it's the Record-Herald, and so on. And
well, let me tell you what I just discovered. They had a news blackout on the actual nature of the wars. So every time something happens, it's described as union, members of a union fighting other members of a union, when in fact it's hired gangsters, hired by the McCormicks or the Hearsts. They call it union wars.
Yeah. I know you have these stories. There were all these toughs running around whose job it was to to kill people and beat them up and scare them and so on. And of course, there's a wonderful history of organized crime in the 1929 Illinois Crime Survey, which is also available on our site.
May I say for the
work.
public record, it is a wonderful, astonishing work of art and sociology. It has never really been matched. I would die. Those of you listening on the World Wide Web at the moment, I would die to have my own copy of the 1929 Illinois Crime Survey.
It is an astonishing work.
1,000 pages?
1,500 pages. Yeah. It's all up on our website,
it's a great
ladies
read.
and gentlemen. It's a great read, and the part on the history of organized crime in Chicago
is brilliant.
It's brilliant, very valuable. For example, in the beer wars, I mean, we all talk about violence now in Beirut and where violence occurs. In the beer wars, there were 103 bombings in a single year. Now, that's a lot of bombings. Now, some of them maybe were small bombings, but, you know, that's a lot of bombs in the city of Chicago. It's like one every 3 days.
And by 1928, sort of around the elections of 28, you have the houses of congressmen, a senator, being blown up by bombs. You have bombs planted and then diffused in one of the larger public markets in the city. It is like Beirut.
All these issues of terrorism, bombs, how do you control violence and terrorism are still very much with us today, to put it mildly. Let's talk a little bit about prohibition, the role of alcohol, especially in some of the cases that you talk about. I mean, you get the feeling, at least from reading your cases and also from reading a number of cases in the data set, that like the whole city was on a drunk.
Well, look, the Tribune starts publishing what it calls the clock of death. And it starts publishing, in fact, thumbnail photographs, whole pages of them, of people who have died. In the case of the thumbnail photographs, died through not through alcohol, through automobiles. So you have a first generation of people who own cars. Population of Chicago increases by 20%. The number of cars increases by 400%. Yeah. And you have alcohol.
Not only that, but nobody knows how to drive.
Right.
You have people who don't know how to drive. They drink. They get in these cars. The cars weren't that safe. The roads weren't safe. One of the things that's so astonishing when you read the public health reports is the number of people who were killed at these streetcar crossings.
Right.
It's like 300 people in 6 months. Many of them children.
Look, not only do they not know how to drive, no one else knows how to drive. So you have alcohol-related automobile fatalities. And you have stories where you can see people struggling with the idea of criminal responsibility. Someone kills another person. Is it manslaughter? Is it murder? What is it? So there's that. The clock of death has three hands. One is the automobile deaths, one is moonshine deaths, and one is just plain good old murder.
And those are chronicled by the Tribune?
Yeah, and they have a graphic display. Maybe it's published once a week. Yeah. It's the clock of death.
Exactly. And you know, in the homicide database, one of the things we see an increasing number of the automobile cases, although it should be noted they don't account for the big rise in homicides in the 20s. Yes, they're important, but they don't account for the big jump up. Nor does organized crime, at least according to our analysis so far.
Absolutely right.
So what is it? I mean, first of all, a lot of it is cases like the Orthwein case, which you just described, where somebody shoots their lover and somebody shoots their brother or their grandfather.
Right. It is examples of middle-class folly. I mean, one of the things that happens is personal folly, middle-class private folly becomes public theater. So who knows? The statistics, though, don't lie. I mean, the Government Census Bureau publishes these morbidity and mortality tables, I don't know, once every 5 years, in between its census. And these facts, the 20% rate. There were other cities like Memphis or Nashville that had higher crime rates, but Chicago is the second largest city in the United States.
Yeah, and it does have this astonishingly high homicide rate during this period. The impetus for forming the commission, which ended up with the publication of the 1929 Illinois Crime Survey, was because all sorts of public-spirited people formed this Blue Ribbon Commission. They were so upset about the high crime rate in 1924, 25, and 26. Right. So That's how that whole commission started. And the group of people who served on that commission, including the dean of our law school, Dean Wigmore, and many, many other notables from the University of Chicago, and progressives and sociologists and so on, they couldn't just dismiss that. So it's formed at the time when Mayor Deaver comes in, the reform-minded mayor. Then he's bounced out, but they can't really get rid of this commission because it's got all these important people sitting on it.
Deaver lets the evil spirits out of the bottle. I mean, Deaver and his police chief, they're reform-minded people. But, I mean, under Big Bill Thompson, it was a sort of laissez-faire. You take this part of town, you take that part of town. Deaver comes in and says all bets are off. And guess what? Guys like Torrio and Capone moved to Cicero. So it's just different,
Exactly.
but relocated. But it goes on. And you've got breweries, may I note, for the record, in 1927, the U.S. Attorney says that Capone, they estimate Capone's gross income at $107 million. That's in 1920s dollars. Multiply that by 10.
Yeah, it's a huge amount of money, and the money's flowing everywhere too.
Right.
The money and the alcohol are linked together, and they are flowing everywhere. I mean, people wouldn't be killing each other over this if there weren't a lot of money involved. Let's talk about the guns too.
All right.
What about the guns?
All right, the guy who brings the first Thompson submachine gun into town is Dino Baggins, the guy who was the hijacker, who learns his trade as a hijacker by working for the Hearsts originally. He brings it in from Colorado. His buddies in Colorado brings it in. Thompsons are chambered, if I am not a firearms expert, but I do read. So 45, they fire 45s. They were developed in the First War. They're military weapons. They were used as trench sweepers. So Thompsons come in, but besides the Thompsons that can put out maximum 800 rounds a minute, if you're good at changing magazines, they also have shotguns. And the most lethal specialists, these are essentially like Navy SEALs. A couple of guys, one is named Anselmi, one is named Scalisi. They're Sicilians. They work for the Jenna brothers, known as the Terrible Jennas. They're really good with shotguns, either sawed-off shotguns or repeating shotguns. And they kill very many important, powerful guys using shotguns.
And they kill their rivals in the gang wars. Talk a bit about this big shootout which occurs with the Jenners.
The Jenners decide at a certain point that Dino Baggins has hijacked his last load of their wretched alcohol. And on top of that, O'Banion has just told Capone and Capone's boss, John Torrio, he's leaving the business. Why don't they buy him out of the Sebin Brewery? He knows there's going to be a federal bust at the Sebin. The guys say, you're going to leave the business, Dean. How much do you need? Dean says, only $500,000. So they give him $500,000, and O'Banion sets them up to be busted by federal and local police at the Sebin Brewery.
Needless to say, they don't take kindly to this.
They're really, really upset by this little trick. Now, O'Banion's a witty guy. He's even stolen whiskey out of warehouses and replaced it with water. As I said, he's an Irish Catholic in terms of his wit, if you will. So they decide to destroy him, and the Jenners, the terrible Jenners, are responsible for this. And the Jenners make use of these two firearms experts, shotgun experts, Anselmi and Scalisi. You look at these guys, they're small, little, nice-looking, not very important-looking guys.
Are there pictures of them on the
There's one.
Yeah.
There's one. Anyway, sooner or later, a war starts. Once Dino Baggins is killed, the people who are his friends go after Capone and Torrio. And there's a series of assaults and counter-assaults, attacks and counterattacks. And one of them involves one of the Jenners, these two guys, Anselmi, Scalisi, and they walk into a trap. They think they're going to be the hunters. They turn out to be the prey. They get out with only two guys dead, and they're leaving the scene of the shootout when they're chased by a car full of detectives who are there just prowling the streets looking. These guys, the Jenners and Anselmi and Scalisi, are so pumped up from this gunfight that they don't realize that the cops are the cops. because the cops are in plain clothes. And there is a car chase at about 70 miles an hour, and then a crash, and then a shootout with shotguns. One of the Jenners bleeds to death in a basement, and Selmy and Scalise are captured. 2 detectives die immediately. One has his jaw blown off and lives. One is shot in the chest and lives. And there are now 3 trials. And the trials go on for several years with the best criminal defense lawyers money can buy. There's a $100,000 defense fund. Multiply that by, again, a factor of 10. And they walk based upon self-defense. The cops are doing something illegal by stopping them without a warrant. The cops were not dressed as cops. The cops came at them with guns. All of this is true and untrue. Every citizen has a right to defend himself against these unlawful actions, and you know what? The jury believed it. Also, the jury lived in terror of its own life, so of course it would believe it.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about that, because one of the things that emerges in your stories and that everyone talks about who works on our database is what's the level of corruption in the legal system? Were jurors getting paid off? Were judges getting paid off? How will we ever know? And of course, that's also
how will we know? These 2 guys walk after shooting 2 cops immediately, blowing one man's jaw off and shooting another man in the chest. 3 trials. Why did they get off?
Exactly. Also, this is self-defense.
Yeah.
These gangsters. Yeah. But let's go to the music.
Wait, I have one story. Okay. I must tell you. Okay, this is one of the great stories. Dino Baggins is arrested in an office with 2 other guys in a room full of smoke and debris. They've just blown a safe. A sergeant walks in and arrests them in the middle of the smoke. So they go to trial, and O'Banion says, look, I can explain things. The 3 of us were next door at a restaurant having chocolate eclairs. We heard an explosion, and like any citizens, we went to investigate.
We rushed over to help.
So it was only a coincidence that we happened to be there when the sergeant arrived. Now the fact is, there's a watchman who sees them climb in the window before the explosion. It goes on. The jury, in its wisdom, decides, of course, they were eating chocolate eclairs next door, and they just came to investigate. Now, when that happens, you begin to think, how much money was involved here?
Right. How much money went to the jury? Yeah. How much money went to the judge, and so on? Well, there are many stories like that. Let's talk a little bit about Chicago, the musical Chicago, the author of the play, which Chicago was based on, the fact that it was a series of Tribune stories, and also that there were all these acquittals.
Right. All right. Maureen Watkins is the through line in terms of the Tribune reporter. She is a well-educated person.
Goes to Yale Drama School.
She goes to Yale Drama School after the Tribune. Right. She goes to college. She studies, I believe she studies classical languages for a PhD at Radcliffe afterwards. She ends up writing copy. She needs a job. She doesn't come close to writing a thesis. She writes ad copy for Standard Oil. She gets tired of that and walks into the Tribune. She is not the first girl reporter they hire. They hire a really amazing woman named Genevieve Forbes, who then becomes Genevieve Forbes Herrick, before Maureen Watkins ever shows up. They send Maureen Watkins to cover the stories, and she does. The first one has to do with a woman who is severely alcoholic, who has been in the paper since 1917. She's a real character. Her name is Belva Gartner. She was a cabaret dancer. She dressed in halter tops and pantaloons. She marries a manufacturer of scientific instruments who loves her dearly, and she marries him 3 times. He's a real sucker. Okay, he walks in on her, with other men. He hires detectives, she hires detectives. The detectives chase each other around like a silent film. She's been in the papers since 1917. The other one is Beulah Annan. She's drop dead beautiful. She's got a 7-year-old son in Kentucky. She's married to an older guy named Al. Okay, she is messing around with a guy from work, from a laundry where she works. Everything's alcohol related. Beulah Annan, has drunk at least half a gallon of moonshine with the guy she ends up shooting in the back. Belva Gardner ends up disposing of at least a couple of quarts before she has an alcoholic blackout, she claims, and shoots her lover in the front seat of the Nash that he just sold her. He's a car salesman.
What do the newspapers and the courts do when they get these cases?
Well, they just follow, well, what does Maureen Watkins do? Okay, ultimately, because there's only one witness to the shooting of the guy in the front seat of the Nash, and the same criminal defense lawyers hired by her former husband, the rich guy, who becomes her third husband, they keep getting married to each other. Okay, these criminal defense lawyers say there are no witnesses, she can't remember anything, so we'll not present an opening argument, we'll present no witnesses, we'll present no closing argument, end of story, they acquit her. Yeah. With Beulah Annan, she's so beautiful that she develops a story over time, 3 different stories, the final one told in a cute southern voice, with a little girl voice, with a southern accent, with woeful glances at the jury, who are all men. You pointed out to me that there are no women on juries in Chicago until 1939. All these guys, including 4 bachelors, their hearts melt and they acquit her too.
Yes, well, the folklore, of course, is among jury specialists that the women jurors are much harder on
Absolutely.
the women defendants than the male jurors are.
Right. So these women they stay in jail for a month and they're acquitted. They stay in jail for 3 months and they're acquitted. Now the story about Maureen Watkins is real interesting because she covers Leopold and Loeb, the best of my understanding, and goes to New York. Quits the Tribune, goes to New York, goes to Yale Drama. To do Yale Drama, this new workshop, you have to write a play. She writes a play called A Brave Little Woman. Her professor loves the play.
Who's the famous professor of playwriting
I can't
at
remember
Yale.
his name, but he's never given an A in his life.
Yeah.
He gives her an A, the play gets produced, and it becomes a comedy. It's the comedy. So she ends up writing screenplays for most of her professional life. She retires, she moves in with her mom in Florida, she becomes a fundamentalist Christian, and she now walks around with guilt. For the last 20 years of her life, according to my best sources, she pays the company that owns the right to the play, Chicago, $500 a year to prevent it from ever being produced again.
And the play is basically the story that appears in the musical and subsequently in the movie.
Yes.
And it's a story of women who kill their husbands and lovers getting off.
And who are self-sufficient, quote, empowered. The fact is one of them shot her boyfriend after he told her he was leaving her. And there's good evidence that the other one, the one who killed the car salesman, also shot that guy because he was going to leave her too. So truth is truth, and literary journalism is literary journalism, and fiction is fiction.
Yes.
I mean, she ends up, the author, Maureen Watkins, ends up going to her grave ashamed that she had turned what were really pretty sleazy and sad tragedies into comedies.
That's correct. And actually there's a nice book published by the University of Kansas Press about Chicago, the play, the original newspaper articles by Maureen Watkins, and anyone who's interested in that can find that book, and it's a very good book. But let's go back to the cases.
I mean, Beulah Annan shoots this guy in the back. His name is Harry. She shoots him, and he doesn't die. So she is nervous, she says. And so he's bleeding in this little apartment. She doesn't know what to do. And she puts on a record called Hula Lou. And Maureen Watkins, who really has a wonderful instinct for black comedy, quotes the lines of the refrain. It's a foxtrot. Hula Lou has more lovers than fleas. So she's listening to this on and off and probably drinking for 4 hours. She knows her husband, who works as an auto mechanic, is going to be coming home. So just before 5, before he leaves, she calls him at work and says, "Al, I shot a guy. He tried to make love to me. I shot him. Al comes home. This guy's still alive. Al calls the police station. She grabs the phone from his hand, and as the sergeant answers the phone at the police station, she shrieks into the phone, "I just shot my husband." So the cops show up, and by now the guy is dead. He died 30 minutes before they showed up. But they take her in. She is very upset. Al is dismayed. They allow her to sober up and calm down. She's told a story that she didn't know him, except from work. She's absolutely surprised. She tries to get away from him. Al keeps a .38 under the pillow, her husband. She backs away. He comes at her, and of course, she shoots him. The police say, "You shot him in the back, sweetheart." So they allow her to sober up, and they take her back to the apartment. Now, you talk about police work. The police almost always took these people back to the scene of the crime and humiliated them.
Yeah, that is actually a common police practice, and in the 1929 robbery that Tom Garrity talks about and writes about in his article in the Journal of Criminal Law and Criminology, the standard thing was reenact the crime. So they take these robbers back to the bank where there's the holdup. They dress them up in the clothes they were supposedly wearing. They ask all the witnesses to watch while they reenact the crime. Right. So
it's a completely corrupted set of testimonies.
Yeah.
They take Bienen back, and the record player has blood on it. There's blood everywhere, so tell us about it. And she breaks down and she confesses. They put her in jail. Belva Gartner, the one who shot the car salesman in the front seat of the car he sold her, she's already in jail. I should note there are 2 African-American women who are still in jail waiting to be tried. There's a Sicilian woman in jail. There's just an ordinary white American woman in jail. They're all waiting for her. So she shows up and she starts getting presents. All this is in the papers. She gets flowers, she gets a really nice steak dinner, and before she knows it, she gets 2 lawyers donated to her by some anonymous patron, the same people who bought her steak dinners. These 2 lawyers show up at the inquest, and they create the first real story she tells. The story is, this guy showed up, she knew him, it's true, she was having an affair, but she wanted him to leave, and he wouldn't leave. Well, they were sitting on her bed at the time. Who knows? They were sitting on the bed, and they both got into an argument. Well, the argument heated up. They were sitting on the bed. They saw this gun sticking out from under the pillow, her husband's gun. They both went for the gun. But she was quicker. She was quicker, and so she shot him before he could shoot her. Now, that's great. The people at the inquest hear this. 20 minutes later, they decide she's guilty of murder.
So the people in the inquest aren't fooled by this?
No. But it's the beginning of a wonderful fable. And by the time, within a month, she goes to trial, she's developed it. Not only did they both go for the gun, but the reason she asked him to leave was that she was in a delicate condition. She was pregnant. And so she was not only fighting to save her own life, but the life of her child. Well, you know, I mean, at that point, the 4 bachelors on the jury, this is all described by Maureen Watkins, the 4 bachelors on the jury listen to her. The prosecutor reads aloud in his own voice her confessions, both confessions. The first one, she hardly knew the guy. The second one, she shot him in the back. Reads it aloud, but he doesn't have the voice, the beauty, or the charm of the defendant. Plus, he's the wrong gender. So he reads it aloud. She tells her own story. She's acquitted. This is Beulah Annan. She's Roxy Hart.
She's Roxy Hart in Chicago.
In Chicago.
Exactly. And actually, the reality is very close to the story in the play and in the musical.
The wonderful thing is the end story. The end story is her faithful husband, Al, who's presented as a poor schmo in the movie.
Mr. Cellophane.
Yeah, Mr. Cellophane. Leaves her the day after she's acquitted, just walks out on her. He's had it. He stands by her, but he's gone. 6 months later, she goes to a party. She meets a guy at a party. He's a former boxer. He and his brother own garages. They fall in love. His family doesn't want him to marry her because they read the papers like everyone else. They get married, they elope to L.A. 3 months later, she divorces him. Not only is he cruel, but he hasn't gotten divorced from his first wife. 8 months after that, more or less, she checks herself in under the name of her first husband, checks herself into a TB sanitarium, and she dies of TB. Her mother takes her body back to Kentucky, buries her. End of that story? Not quite. Al, faithful Al, who left her the day after the trial, goes back to Louisville. Louisville is where Al first met the beautiful Beulah Annan. Al goes back to Louisville, and he gets married again. So, mid-30s, the police arrest him. Why? He just beat his wife to death.
Oh my, that is an amazing end story. That's an amazing end story. Well, it's also an example of how when you get interested in these cases and you start following these trails, they lead you places you never expect.
Who could have, well, I would have imagined.
Who could predict
I
that?
thought the movie was the truth.
But also to follow the little minor characters like the husband who goes back to Louisville and that. I mean, it is amazing. And of course, thanks to the newspapers, we can find these things out.
Well, thanks to the newspapers and the ProQuest, the search service, you say to ProQuest, I want to know about so-and-so. They will find that service is, like a bunch of robot mice. They will find the cheese anywhere.
Yeah, it's astonishing. And of course, as more and more text and old text gets incorporated onto the web, and as it becomes digitalized and capable of being searched by Google or somebody else, we're going to be able to do this with a greater and greater archives. Well, let's just close by talking a little bit about how haunting some of these narratives and photographs are, and how they so capture the imagination, and the interaction between especially the photographs and the stories of the people.
I think the stories have legs. The photographs, in this case, I've used photographs as standalone forms of primary data. These photographs have their charm, but they exist really as illustrations of written narrative. So call this a book in the process of being made into a book. This is a book which will be illustrated with photographs. Unlike other things that I've made, other books, if you will, that I've made, these photographs serve written narrative rather than vice versa.
Yes, and they give a kind of immediacy and concrete quality to the written narrative.
I agree. There is sensory data. There's the pleasure of the face. There's the pleasure of the costume. There's the pleasure of simply knowing that the Beulah Annan was as beautiful as everyone said.
Yeah, it is astonishing. Well, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And again, let me just repeat, this is Michael Lesy, a professor of literary journalism at Hampshire College in Amherst, Massachusetts, and the book is Murder City, to be published by Norton in 2007.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good.